The moment Avada hit the water, a chill rolled through him, but the freezing sensation was quickly banished by the warming charm he'd cast before the dive. The cold turned into a pleasant heat, and for a few strokes he could tell there were no obvious traps in the shallow layer beneath the surface. Sunlight filtered down in a faint blue wash, everything around him clear. No debris, no flashes of hidden magic. If anything, he thought, there's no warding nearby. I can keep going. He checked the environment with his magic senses. Nothing dangerous showed. Then he tucked his head, kicked hard, and used small currents of magic to drive himself deeper. The light thinned as he plunged. His vision dimmed until he could barely make out his own hands. Then the golden egg cradled against his chest began to glow, carving a narrow ribbon of light through the dark, pointing straight at a place on the lake bed ahead. "The golden egg in your hands," Barty explained in the Durmstrang headmaster's office as he briefed the champions, "will glow once you dive and guide you to the nearest ghost ship from your entry point. Don't worry about the ships colliding. The 3 entry points during the task are widely separated, and the ghost ships will be placed close to each entry so your eggs won't lead you to the same vessel. In our original design, the completeness of your egg affected the accuracy. A more intact egg would cast a precise light. A damaged one would only give a hazy glow. However, since all 3 champions have already fully repaired their eggs, that distinction no longer matters." Outside the bubblehead charm, the water had darkened from pale blue to an inky depth where a hand in front of your face vanished. Sound died away until Avada felt only the thud of his heartbeat. If not for the glow from the egg lighting half his body and the slight resistance against his fingers when he moved, he would have suspected a spatial rift. Merlin's beard, he thought. Does Durmstrang's lake not have an inch of shallow bottom? I've been swimming forever, and all there is water. But the simplicity had its advantages. Without complicated terrain, many dangerous aquatic creatures, Grindylows among them, would have been able to take advantage of hiding places. The flatness removed that problem. The only real downside was that it might be a bit boring for the crowd. He remembered Fleur Delacour. In the earlier task, she had shown tremendous power, forcing a Ukrainian ironbelly into submission with pure firepower, but in the original story, she was undone by ordinary aquatic beasts. For Avila, who relied on flight and flame, the water crippled her strength. That only underlined how dangerous those creatures were to wizards who couldn't fight underwater. Then Avada noticed the current changing. He almost missed it at first. The water in a patch ahead had begun to stir, an undercurrent twisting itself into an invisible whirlpool. Its range was wide. Circling around it would be time-consuming. He decided to go through. He flicked his wand. A mass of ice crystals blossomed from nothing beside him, spreading outward and driving straight into the churning patch. The current buffeted the ice at first, but as the crystal grew larger, the turbulence lost its bite. "Mr. Ken has frozen the surrounding water. Merlin's beard. He's made an enormous ice structure on the spot," Barty called from the stands, commentating on the 3 champions' progress. The white mist on the shore had split into 3 panes, each showing a diver's every move. Fleur, like Avada, was advancing with a bubblehead charm. Crumb had transformed his head into that of a shark to breathe and move more efficiently. Both had only just entered the water and were nowhere near Avada's depth. "He's using the thick ice to block the dangerous undercurrents, then tunneling through it. Clever. Going around would have taken several times as long." "Ah, Mr. Crumb has hit trouble at his shallow entry point. It looks like a band of Grindylows has been lying in wait," Barty added, his voice betraying none of the man's darker affiliations, merely excited by the action. Crumb, hidden by fronds of weed, was being set upon and seethed at the thought of letting loose fiend fire in front of everyone. Avada kept descending. The golden egg's light brightened. The ghost ship was near. More traps followed, a school of carnivorous-looking fish swirling in a hunting pattern. Sudden patches of water that froze without warning, threatening to lock him in place. A wide stretch of potion-tainted water that produced an unbearable itching on skin contact, with the antidote cunningly hidden nearby, so competitors had to find it while enduring the torment. Whoever designed this course had a devilish sense of mischief. He overcame them all. Finally, the egg's beam fell across an old wooden skiff with a closed cabin, the ghost ship. Before the boat, something enormous lay coiled and still in the gloom. At the egg's light, it began to stir, its shadowy bulk twisting as if answering the summons. 362, long-horned river snake. As the dark shape rushed closer, Avada finally made out its full form, a serpent some 30 to 40 feet long, covered in hard, pitch-black scales. It resembled the basilisk he had seen 2 years earlier, but it lacked that creature's pure malice and lethal dark arts. What made it most striking was the pair of curved horns like a ram's that crowned its otherwise ordinary snake head, an incongruous detail that gave it its name, the long-horned river snake. He recognized it immediately, a XXX class magical creature, notorious for its biological variety, diverse abilities, and sheer difficulty to deal with. In his memory, the long-horned river snake could, like the thunderbird, influence the weather within a radius, bringing heavy rain, raging winds, even thunderstorms. It could turn invisible, had limited transfiguration powers, and could hypnotize. Its physical strength ranked among the best of magical creatures. Even within XXX, it was in the top tier. It wasn't labeled XXX only because its species wasn't generally considered overly aggressive. Yet the fact that this specimen had been chosen as a guardian for the Triwizard tournament told him everything. Its temper here would be far worse than normal. Avada frowned, lifted his wand, and sent out another pillar of ice. The column slammed into the long-horned river snake like a hook, then, under his transfiguration, hardened into thick steel chains that coiled over it. In seconds, the beast was bound, unable even to lash out. This would buy him only a little time, he thought. Mockery flashed in the snake's cold eyes. Its body suddenly contracted, slipped through a narrowing of the coils as if it had never been caught, and with a flick of its tail it swam free. Then it melted into the dark water, dissolving as if it had become liquid. Transfiguration and invisibility, he realized. Avada tightened his focus and raised his occlumency. Invisibility didn't worry him. His magical senses could see through it unless a soul was hidden, but his senses registered the snake swimming around him at an unbelievable speed, quietly accumulating energy and beginning to weave a spell that made Avada's head throb. He couldn't interrupt it from here. Better to block it. He began to condense layers of ice crystals around himself. They formed a hollow sphere, which transfiguration turned into thick, glassy insulation. A moment later, a burst of electric arcs flashed in the water nearby and dissolved into the lake. Had he not created the insulating sphere in time, the shock would have been strong enough to knock him out, and this was under 100 meters of water. Such attacks were hard to stop. The snake's movement speed kept it elusive, and the water itself was an enemy to a wizard. Spells fired underwater lost power, range, and speed. Aiming and movement cost far more energy. Water is difficult material to transfigure. Freezing it is possible, but freezing enough of it into substantial blocks is exhausting. For these reasons, the magical community's understanding of deep-water creatures remained limited. Only those that preferred shallow waters ever entered Wizard's field of study. Deep lake bottoms were largely unknown, and facing a XXX-level creature in the water was a nightmare for most wizards. This snake being used as a Triwizard guardian, approved by Dumbledore and the others, told him it was meant to be a real challenge. He wondered if every champion was getting the same final obstacle, or if he'd been singled out for something worse. He thought of Fleur, who in the original tournament had been eliminated by a few Grindylows, and wondered how she would fare here. Grumbling, Avada dispelled the transfiguration binding the water and reapplied an insulating charm. He felt a mild pressure against his occlumency, the snake's hypnotic magic probing, testing. No, he needed to make an active move, not just stall. He began to generate crystals again, transfiguring them into tools to restrain the serpent, while devoting part of his mind to silently analyzing the broadcasting enchantments that relayed the match. He needed a brief window to get out of full view of the spectators so he could use spells the tournament rules might frown upon. By the lakeside, Barty continued his loud-running commentary. Mr. Ken's luck is not good. The ghost ship guarding him is watched over by the most feared of long-horned river snakes. In such a water-heavy, disadvantageous environment, Even a powerful champion like Mr. Ken finds it difficult to cope. His tactics that worked against the dragon don't seem to apply here. Nonetheless, he has shown exceptional transfiguration, using the lake itself to form ice and engage the snake. Oh, Mr. Ken appears to have thickened the water into ink. Is he trying to block the snake's vision? Dear audience, don't worry. Our broadcast charms can see through invisibility and obstacles. For example, this long-horned river snake has been invisible this whole time, but we can still pick it up clearly. Why has our screen gone entirely black? It's back. Please understand, our broadcast magic has a slight delay. Sometimes the reaction is a bit slow, only a second or two, right? What Barty and the rest of the spectators didn't know was that during that blacked-out second or two, Avada had taken careful aim with his wand. The snake's pupils unfocused for a heartbeat, then slowly refocused. Its movements grew a touch stiffer. Any observant watcher might have suspected what had caused that change. Imperio. 363. Golden Egg and Ghost Ship. There was no way. Avada Ken simply didn't have the energy to go toe-to-toe with the long-horned river snake right now. He had to conserve his strength for whatever surprises Dumbledore might throw at him. If he unleashed everything he had, the power he could muster would be at least on par with a school dean, and some of the self-researched magic he'd never shown before might even turn the tide in a fight. That made his true strength even greater than it already seemed. No matter the scale of the battle, that level of force could not be wasted on a single creature. In fact, if he'd relied only on transfiguration to wear the snake down, he could have defeated it in the water, but doing so would have drained him mentally and physically. He didn't have any recovery potions on him, and he couldn't afford to be exhausted. So, under Ken's masterful use of Imperio, the long-horned river snake began to cooperate with uncanny precision. Between man and snake, there was a constant exchange, dazzling maneuvers, powerful spells streaking through the water. A few times, Ken found himself in genuine danger, almost overwhelmed, but he always managed to reverse the situation with practiced skill, drawing repeated gasps from the spectators on the shore. Mr. Ken seems to have read the river snake's rhythm, Barty shouted over the roar of the crowd. See, he ducked the attack like he predicted it and led the snake right into a trap he set earlier. Oof, that had to hurt. Is this match about to end? The snake isn't unconscious, but it's clearly rattled. The river snake's using stealth again, another commentator added. But its stealth has been seen through. Mr. Ken knows what it's doing, and he looks ready to finish it off. Merlin's beard. What is this? A huge net has appeared out of nowhere and wrapped the snake. Its stealth didn't work. This net covers the whole water area, even the ghost ship. No matter how it twists, it can't escape. Wait, how did Mr. Ken build such an enormous transfiguration so fast? No, it wasn't made instantly. He planned this from the start. He's been laying threads the whole time and quietly weaving them into a net. His fighting, his movements, even his spell work were all preparing this final blow. Now the long-horned river snake is helpless. That means Mr. Ken and his ghost ship can act without hindrance. He's swimming over, firing off a few stupefy spells and undoing part of the net to pull out the ghost ship that was trapped earlier. Excellent. Mr. Ken is the first champion to board his ghost ship. When Avada Ken disappeared from the misty broadcast screen, leaving only a battered wooden boat floating quietly, Barty hurriedly separated a new portion of mist with his wand and explained to the viewers. To withstand the immense pressure of the deep water, the champion's ghost ships are protected by very powerful enchantments, so powerful that our broadcast magic can't directly see inside them. That's why we've placed an additional broadcasting charm within the ship's hull. We know that causes some inconvenience for you, but it's for the champion's safety. Please understand. Look, Crumb has reached the area near his ghost ship, a step ahead of Fleur Delacour. He seems to be under attack from something he can't see. That's a Kelpie. They can almost merge with the current, making them incredibly hard to spot. Miss Delacour's in trouble too. She's falling behind. She doesn't seem accustomed to the underwater environment. Avada had already climbed into his ghost ship. Barty had been right. The vessel was sealed by powerful protections. When Ken opened the hatch, the cabin's waterproofing alone could resist the pressure of hundreds of meters of water. Even as droplets clung to his clothes and hair from the outside, the air inside was dry and seemed to glow, lighting the small cabin clearly. It was cramped, only a few square meters, with a single chair and a small platform the size of a table before it. But Ken didn't immediately take the helm. He first scanned the interior with care. As expected, it was cleverly hidden. After running his magical senses over the cabin and analyzing the warding for a moment, Ken nodded to himself and admitted Barty's cunning. The traps on the golden egg were extremely well concealed. Without knowing the backstory, even someone like Dumbledore might dismiss them as redundant details and overlook the real danger. He brushed his hand against the phoenix feather sewn into the lining of his clothing, then set the golden egg he'd been cradling on the platform. The egg's surface melted like honey and flowed across the platform, a stream of molten gold. The egg's original bottom merged with something embedded in the platform and transfigured into the shape of a steering wheel, the final function of the golden egg and the key to activating the ghost ship. The more intact the egg, the smoother the steering wheel and the better the control over the ship. Since all three champions had received complete golden eggs, none of them would suffer from poor steering responsiveness. At the same time, the trap magic, partly stored in the golden egg and integral to Barty's ultimate plan, also completed its work. 364. Waterway teleportation. First like this, and then like this. Done. He stopped bothering with fully formed trap magic and instead casually examined the transfigured rudder. Even though Barty had briefly gone over the ghost ship's controls and the trigger for waterway teleportation when he explained the rules a week ago, there was a difference between hearing the steps and actually operating the device. It took him a while to get the hang of it. He slid his wand back into his pocket, then dug his hand in deeper, as if afraid it might fall out, then drew it back again. He sat on the bare wooden chair and gripped the rudder with both hands. The moment his palms closed around the handles, the whole ship trembled faintly, and a low rumble filled the cabin. The wooden wall in front of him began to turn transparent, revealing the water ahead. He even saw a portion of the golden egg that had earlier melted into the control panel, now projecting a thick beam of light forward. So the golden egg could function as a searchlight when embedded in the ship. Its effectiveness probably depended on how intact the egg was. If the pureblood families and Barty hadn't insisted on skullduggery, the design of this Triwizard Challenge would have been spectacular and visually striking, at least for the audience. Rumble. The ghost ship began to move, slowly at first. It was almost pitch black outside, so he couldn't tell how fast they were going, only felt a faint push against his back, suggesting they weren't moving very quickly. All right, Crumb and Fleur should be wrapping up soon. Time to put the plan in motion. He took a slow breath. His right-hand fingers curled around something hidden in his sleeve. The fox feather he'd slipped out of his pocket and concealed when he'd stowed his wand. Waterway teleportation. When the runes on the rudder registered the command, the ghost ship, gliding at a low speed through the dark water, vanished as if a frame had been skipped. There was no displacement left in its original position, no hole where it had been. It was as if the ship had never been there at all, or had simply dissolved into the lake. Huh. On the shore, students who had been cheering Crumb's clash with the hippogriff or rooting for Fleur suddenly froze. On the live feed showing Mr. Ken's movements inside the ghost ship cabin, the misty screen that normally relayed his every action dimmed and reverted to an ordinary white fog drifting in the air. Beside it, the exterior camera, showing the waterway, no longer displayed the ship in the center, just an inky, deep blue stretch of water. Everyone, don't worry. Mr. Ken has not encountered any accident, and the broadcast enchantments are not failing, Barty said, noticing the ripple of concern. He smiled and explained smoothly. This is the ghost ship Mr. Ken is on, performing Durmstrang's signature magic, waterway teleportation. This is an old and rather obscure charm, said to have been devised by Durmstrang's founder, Volcanova. It was applied to that great sailing ship moored on the lake. The magic lets the vessel teleport instantly across stretches of water, much like apparition. Even if two bodies of water are not connected, it can transport a huge ship from one to the other in an instant. Furthermore, this teleportation can move an enormous mass in a single effort. It's not stopped by ordinary anti-apparition jinxes, and its range can be impressively long. If the host of the Tri-Wizard had been Hogwarts rather than Durmstrang, that ship might even teleport into the Black Lake. Durmstrang students lifted their chins with pride. Karkaroff and several professors looked pleased. Barty continued, "Because of the precision and casting difficulty of this charm, the internal broadcast will be temporarily blocked while the ghost ship teleports. But rest assured, the teleportation will only last a few minutes. You should see Mr. Ken reappear at the finish line soon, first to face the final test." Ah, Crumbs finally defeated the Hippogriff. He's gotten into the ship. Crumbs' luck ran well. The Hippogriff is easier to handle than the long-horned river snake, so he's closed the gap with Mr. Ken. He's placed his golden egg in, and it's whole, so he can use all the ship's functions. Excellent. Crumb has started waterway teleportation too. The difference between him and Mr. Ken is less than 2 minutes, so Mr. Ken isn't guaranteed victory yet. The broadcasts will resume in 5 minutes. For now, let's turn our attention to Miss Delacour. On the foggy screen showing Fleur, she had at last, in an anxious flurry, outmaneuvered the last of the Grindylows and swum a little farther downstream toward the final test before the ship. A giant squid! Hogwarts students gasped. Their own Black Lake was notorious for the creature, which had hauled many drowning first years ashore over the years. The squid on the screen looked a bit smaller than Hogwarts's, with a slightly different coloration, but its enormous eyes carried an extra trace of something fierce. The difficulty of fighting this creature underwater is no less than the long-horned river snake. Its body is as powerful as a dragon's, making it almost immune to the spells of wizards who aren't skilled at underwater casting, and its strength can demolish most transfigured constructs. It's also one of the most intelligent aquatic beasts known. It can even communicate with humans to some extent. It looks like Miss Delacour is in for serious trouble. Huh? To everyone's surprise, the giant squid's great eyes dimmed, and it bobbed lazily, appearing to fall asleep. Fleur let out a triumphant smile, kicked strongly, and swam into the ghost ship's cabin. 365. Ballon's secret trump card. Looking down at the bewildered faces in the crowd, Barty couldn't help sneering inside. A bunch of naive fools, you haven't seen anything yet. Dumbledore's death, the Dark Lord's return, those were far more exciting than any child's game. Would they like to witness them? It didn't matter if they didn't. The broadcasting enchantments he'd set up would show every drop of blood when Dumbledore died, transmit it back to Hogwarts, and let the Master wake to a school broken and submissive. Then those traitors and mudbloods would die in utter despair. Karkaroff had been useful this time. He'd finally managed to get those 3 kids onto the ghost ship and trigger the water teleportation almost at once, maximizing the pressure Dumbledore would face later. If luck held, they might not even need to get their hands dirty. For his help, once the Master recovered, Barty could put in a word to lessen the punishment for that coward. After all, the man was shameless and untrustworthy, but he had brains and could be useful when their interests aligned. Don't think betraying your classmates will be forgotten, Karkaroff. When the Master breaks out of Azkaban, guess how those you betrayed will treat you? Heh. Even though he was about to set a plan in motion that would eclipse anything done before, Barty felt no tension. Their plot had been worked out in meticulous detail. The support of so many pure-blood families had been secured. Dumbledore, that old half-blood, remained entirely oblivious. More importantly, they had the promise and help of that gentleman. Even if this plan failed, it didn't matter. Once the backup at Hogwarts kicked in, Dumbledore could never completely wipe out the Master. And according to the information transmitted yesterday, the mole at Hogwarts had already begun to move, or perhaps had already succeeded. They were invincible. What an astonishing sight. The giant squid's high intelligence actually became a disadvantage against Miss Delacour. Ludo Bagman's voice rang out, exaggeratedly enthusiastic. But Barty's mind was elsewhere. Higher intelligence meant a finer mental structure, Bagman was telling the audience, and that in turn made creatures more vulnerable to mental magic. What was more adept at mental arts than a half-vila? Miss Delacour had hypnotized that poor giant squid with almost no effort. Then again, compared with the other two guardian creatures aboard the ghost ship, maybe the giant squid wasn't so unlucky after all. Excellent. Miss Delacour has finally boarded the ghost ship almost at the same speed as Mr. Crumb. The gap between the three champions has narrowed. The final contest may be fiercer than ever. Bagman continued. The third ghost ship has temporarily disappeared from the screen. I suggest everyone make the most of this time to rest and relax, because in 5 minutes, you might not even dare to blink. When Bagman's words ended, the atmosphere in the stands visibly loosened. Students who had been glued to the feed, hardly daring to breathe, finally began to chatter. Voices rose into a lively hum. The once silent lakeside came back to life. Beauxbaton students fretted for their champion. Durmstrang students cheered Crumb and puffed up with pride, explaining their ancient ghost ship to other schools. Hogwarts, predictably, split between indignation and worry. "This is rigged," murmured Cedric, normally disinclined to jump to spiteful conclusions. 2 tasks in a row, and Ken's had the worst luck. Last time the pillar appeared right under his dragon, and now he's got the long-horned river snake, the worst of the 3 guardians. Both the other champions have had good fortune, someone nearby said. Crumb got his favorite broom in the first task, and Delacour got matched with a guardian she could handle because of her talent. If the Durmstrang organizers were behind it, giving Crumb an edge would be enough. Why help Delacour too? Maybe they want to balance things for entertainment, another replied. Even with those setbacks, Ken was clearly ahead. Remove the external factors, and it would have been a one-sided crush. The tournament's meant to encourage cooperation and friendship, so they have to give the other schools a bit of face. Exactly, and even with such obvious disadvantages, isn't Ken still leading? He's not short on luck. Baron, why aren't you saying anything? Me? Baron startled, blinking as if someone had pulled him back from far away. Nothing, just thinking. He chatted a bit more, keeping his voice casual. No one paid him mind. When the conversation drifted, Baron took a long, quiet breath and tried to calm his racing heart. His hand, slick with cold sweat, slipped into his pocket and closed around a small, key-shaped object. He didn't know if his father's intelligence had been accurate, and he didn't know for certain that the terrible event his father had warned about would occur in a few minutes. But if it was true, if he had learned a secret that made today dangerous, then he would have to risk everything. He would lead the students to safety, protect them from the aftermath. He would use the magical key his father had given him. 5 minutes later, Bagman forced a look of anxious composure. He was barely keeping a smile from breaking free as he addressed the students clustered below the judge's stand, many of them growing restless at the 3 empty, mist-filled screens. "Please, everyone, calm down. There's no need to rush," he said. "The time I gave was the theoretical time. In practice, there's always a margin of error. This is the first time Durmstrang has tried to replicate the water teleportation used by the ghost ships to construct new vessels, so the uncertainty is a bit greater. But rest assured, the technique and the ghost ships themselves have been tested many times by the judges. There's no reason to expect any danger. At worst, it's just taking longer than we anticipated. Our champions are not in immediate peril." Hearing Bagman's confident words, the students who'd been on the verge of panic eased somewhat. Magical mishaps happened. 5 extra minutes wasn't that far off. Still, a smattering of uneasy faces remained among the crowd, and not just one of them belonged to the Baron. Another 5 minutes passed. The students' questions mounted into a clamor that could no longer be contained. Even the judges, who had been composed moments before, were beginning to look worried as they huddled and spoke in low, urgent tones. "I'll go check the magic," Karkaroff snapped, the first to rise. As the head of Durmstrang, he had the right to apparat within the grounds. With a crack, he vanished from the stand. The 3 misty screens, which had been dark, condensed into one image. Karkaroff beneath the surface, a bubble-head charm protecting his air, his wand probing the black water as he searched for any sign. Seeing the principal actively investigating calmed the crowd somewhat. They no longer seemed inclined to storm the judge's stand. The remaining judges, especially Bagman, sat on edge and waited for news. Minutes crawled by, 3, 10, a lifetime. When Karkaroff finally winked out of the screens and reappeared on the judge's platform, he was soaked through, hair plastered to his brow, and clothes still dripping. He didn't pause to wring himself out. He hurried straight to the other four judges. "Professor Dumbledore," he said, breathless and pale, "I'm afraid we need your help, right away." Dumbledore rose quietly, expression grave. "What is it?" "We've had a failure in the water teleportation," Karkaroff said, teeth chattering from more than cold. "All three ghost ships are stuck in the middle of the transfer, suspended in that in-between watery void, hundreds of meters down." Faces around the stand drained of color. Dumbledore's old wand, it had an odd, ancient look about it, was in his hand in an instant. "We checked the procedure repeatedly," he said. "How could this have happened?" "We haven't determined the cause yet," Karkaroff admitted, "but we can't leave them where they are. We don't know how long the enchantments keeping the ships together can hold in that liminal space between locations. That risk is far worse than the water pressure. If the ship's magic unravels, the champions could be in real danger. I'm afraid only you among us can reach them, Professor." Mr. Crouch and Madame Maxime exchanged looks but said nothing. Both knew Dumbledore's power and the rumors about his wand. Dumbledore's face was all business. "Very well," he said. "Take me to them, Professor Karkaroff. You are more familiar with the mechanics of the water teleportation than I am. I will need your assistance." "That is my duty." Karkaroff nodded and looked at Bagman. "Mr. Bagman, you must come as well. In a situation like this, the champions may be frightened. No one handles that better than you." "Of course," Bagman said, without missing a beat. "Mr. Crouch, Madame Maxime, please remain here and keep the students in order," Karkaroff added. "Durmstrang's professors will assist you. Do not let anything else go wrong." Crouch and Madame Maxime rose and moved among the students, calming and organizing. Karkaroff gripped the sleeves of Dumbledore and Bagman. With a loud crack, the three of them vanished. The misty screens flickered, and a moment later showed a different scene. It was no longer the pitch black of the deep water. Instead, there was an uncanny, open space lit by countless floating bonfires that hung in the air like stars. Vast sheets of lake water churned and surged around this void, but an invisible barrier kept them separated. No current could cross it. The water only whirled and eddied helplessly against the divide. This was the arena that had been chosen for the tournament's final task. Only now it felt hollowed out, as if something had gone wrong in its structure. Three figures had just appeared within that space: Dumbledore, Karkaroff, and Bagman. "Begin, Professor Karkaroff," Dumbledore said as they landed. He drew his old wand and pointed it without hesitation at a precise spot in the void. Karkaroff, eyes sharp, mirrored him and raised his own wand, aiming at exactly the same point. 367, Grindelwald is back. The next instant, two wand tips released waves of deep blue ripples in perfect unison, and the air itself seemed to become water. Through that shimmering, three ghostly shapes appeared, faint, gauze-thin, impossible to make out clearly. "Those are the ghost ships," someone in the stands pointed at the screen. The three spectral forms the pair had summoned were the very ghost ships the champions had ridden. They were pulling objects out of the spatial passage, and from the way Karkaroff had reacted, it looked as if Dumbledore had seen through the warding he'd been probing in an instant. The students who had noticed that detail felt a chill. They were gaining a far more practical sense of the Hogwarts headmaster's power. The rescue took far longer than anyone had expected. Dumbledore and Karkaroff held their wands aloft for nearly 10 minutes. Karkaroff's face had gone ashen. He panted, eyes bloodshot, supporting his wand with his offhand to keep it steady. Even Dumbledore had sweat on his forehead and his long white beard trembling. The strain of the magic was immense. "I can't hold much longer, Albus," Karkaroff finally gasped, stumbling as the spell wavered. His voice came out harsh and squeezed. "I need rest. I can't effectively cooperate anymore. I might even interfere." "Go and rest, Professor Karkaroff," Dumbledore said, his tone no less urgent. "I can hold a little longer. I think we're almost through." "Thank you," Karkaroff began, but his arm dropped as if he'd been drained of strength, and he slumped to the floor. After a moment's panting, he fished an expensive-looking potion from his pocket and downed it in one gulp. His color returned. He met Dumbledore's eyes. "I have one more restorative potion. Do you need it, Albus?" I can apparate back for more. Please. Dumbledore's voice was thin. This magic takes more than I expected. I fear I may need replenishment as well. Before he could finish, Karkaroff apparated with a pop and reappeared behind Dumbledore a few heartbeats later, holding another bottle identical to the first. I'm back, he said, handing it over. Thank you, Professor Karkaroff. Dumbledore made a few quick auxiliary gestures with his left hand, took the bottle Karkaroff had thoughtfully opened, and tipped it to his lips. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Dumbledore spat the potion out with a sound that made the room go very still. His face went black with a complex mix of anger and confusion. He began to turn toward Karkaroff as if to question him, but before he could, Karkaroff and Bagman, who had been standing at his side, raised their wands. 2 emerald green beams lanced out and struck at Dumbledore. Avada Kedavra! The deadly light splashed across half of Dumbledore's face, freezing his shock in place. He had spent almost all his strength holding the salvage enchantment and now had no power left to evade. He could only watch as the killing curses closed in. With a sudden flare, a red flame sprang into existence between the spells and Dumbledore. A magnificent crimson bird, Fawkes, appeared just inches from Dumbledore's back and took the full force of the green lights. With a single, mournful cry, the phoenix combusted into ash. Fawkes! Dumbledore cried, snatching the fledgling from midair as the remains fell and tucking the scorched bird into his arms. Karkaroff! Bagman! Why? Karkaroff and Bagman only sneered. They lowered their wands and took 2 steps back. It isn't us who will kill you, Dumbledore, Bagman said with a mock courtesy, turning his head politely to the empty air beside them. It's your turn now, sir. A cold sneer answered from the space Bagman indicated. The transparent, water-like air rippled and folded, sewing itself together like silk until a humanoid outline formed. Solid color bled into the silhouette, and a full figure resolved from the shimmer. He looked at Dumbledore with complicated eyes and a faint, elusive sneer at the corner of his mouth. He was an old wizard, gaunt, his face carved with deep lines, but his complexion was fresh and his eyes unusually bright and sharp for his years. His posture was straight and exact. Without looking at his face, one would scarcely notice his age. His hair and beard were gray and well-groomed, and he wore a splendid robe, as if freshly returned from a banquet. Long time no see, Albus. It seems you've had a good 50 years, the man said, waving his wand with calm elegance, as if addressing an old acquaintance rather than the most dangerous name in the wizarding world. Dumbledore stared, every muscle frozen. For a long moment he was like stone, oblivious even to the spell he'd been sustaining beginning to fray. His lips trembled before they uttered the name that alone made the magical community shudder. Gellert. 368. Invite to fight. That person looks like. On the lakeshore, the professors who had been trying to keep the students in order were now, like everyone else, utterly transfixed by the image on the screen. The crowd fell into a heavy, nervous silence that made even the smallest sound shocking. Gellert Grindelwald? Grindelwald? An elderly professor's trembling voice set off a ripple of recognition. Is that Grindelwald, the former leader of the wizarding supremacists, imprisoned in Nurmengard? It really looks like him. I've seen his picture in books. Wasn't he locked away ages ago? How is he here? Forget that. Look, the headmaster's been ambushed. We have to go down and help him. Panic spread, but the Hogwarts students, wary of Durmstrang, slipped back at the first chance, putting distance between themselves and the foreign students and professors. They had seen it clearly enough. Durmstrang's headmaster, Igor Karkaroff, had turned on their own headmaster. Even if those Durmstrang people seemed surprised now, their leader had betrayed Dumbledore, who could say their shock wasn't an act, or that some of them hadn't been ordered to cooperate. Madame Maxime, Mr. Crouch, someone shouted toward the only 2 judges left at the lakeshore. What's happening? Professor Dumbledore needs help. We're trying to figure that out, Barty Crouch Sr. answered, his anxiety making his voice rough and loud enough to cut through the chaos. They're at the final stage of the original Triwizard Tournament, over 3,000 feet down. The ghost ship has already been taken by the champions, and we don't have permission to use Durmstrang's large vessel. If we rely only on our wands, it'll take at least 20 minutes to reach them. 20 minutes? Another voice demanded. So we just watch the headmaster get overwhelmed by the three of them? I'm trying, Crouch began, but there was nothing he could do immediately. Below the commotion at the surface, the underwater world was the opposite of the lakeshore's noise. It was all water murmuring and the faint songs of birds Dumbledore held in his arms. Otherwise, there was only silence. In that quiet, two pairs of eyes that had not met for more than 50 years locked on one another again. You still came, Dumbledore said softly after a long pause, his hand still holding the magic that strained to keep the three ghost ships materialized. I thought you'd kept our last promise. I'm afraid not, Albus. Grindelwald shrugged with that elegant arrogance Dumbledore remembered. I'm not as sentimental as you hoped, nor as easily swayed by old loyalties. For the greater good? Dumbledore asked. For the greater good, Grindelwald repeated with a short, cold laugh. I never betrayed my ideals, Albus, not even when you defeated me. I admit the Muggles were stronger than I expected then, and the wizards who sided with them were more united than I imagined. That's why my plans failed, and I spent over 50 years in Nurmengard, but I never truly gave up. If Muggles are allowed to develop unchecked, it will spell disaster for the magical world, Grindelwald continued. As long as I can see that truth, I will not stop. So you allied with the remnants of Voldemort? Dumbledore asked, calm but sharp. You plan to destroy the magical community from within before conquering the Muggles? Their ideas are largely correct, Grindelwald said. Muggleborns are prone to identity confusion and need stricter guidance. Hundreds of years of history prove it. Otherwise, Salazar Slytherin wouldn't have left a basilisk under your noses. You're the one being naive, Albus. Ludo Bagman chuckled behind Grindelwald, a sound that didn't fit the cold exchange. He was almost about to speak, but Karkaroff shot him a look, and the chuckle died. You really thought I did nothing in those 50 years? Grindelwald went on, a smug smile on his face. Though I lost my power back then, my ideals never died. They lingered in many hearts, and my knowledge still drew ambitious young wizards to me. Over decades, I rebuilt my following, some old, many new, and spread influence across Europe. You never noticed. You, Dumbledore said, the chill in his voice finally cracking into anger. He hated how easily he'd been played. The magic he still held to try to keep the ghost ships whole had been slowing without help. Karkaroff's interference had been crucial, and now the truth showed how deep the betrayal ran. Grindelwald's eyes gleamed. And because of those ties, I was put in touch with the wizards who serve Voldemort's cause. Working with them to remove you seemed efficient. In exchange, they'd give me resources and training to restore my power. I promised we would resurrect their master once we'd taken care of you. Then we arranged this Tri-Wizard tournament. Dumbledore's expression tightened. Memory and regret flickered across his face. I trusted you. I never should have. Grindelwald's smile widened. So you were the one who helped me gather young followers with advanced knowledge. Some of the things that attracted them were born of our old research together. You used our shared past to draw them in. How does it feel, Albus, to be outmaneuvered by your own hubris? Without another word, Grindelwald raised his wand, not toward Dumbledore, but at the three ghost ships that wavered, semi-formed in the water. Dumbledore, sluggish and dizzy from poison, tried in a flash to counter, but Grindelwald's wand glowed with that same blue shimmer. The ship's materialization accelerated violently. Within seconds, they solidified completely. Now nothing can distract you, Grindelwald said, as if to punctuate the move. With a casual flick, he teleported the three ships away to some unknown location. Then he turned his wand back toward the exhausted, pale-faced Dumbledore. So then, Albus, Grindelwald said softly, the old challenge returning to his voice, shall we finish what we started? Just like 50 years ago, Dumbledore answered, forced to meet him, every line of his face betraying the strain. 369. One man becomes an army. Is this the way you plan to finish me? A wizard's duel? Dumbledore's voice had gone ice-cold. The ancient, powerful wand in his hand rose slowly, though it still wasn't fully aimed at Grindelwald. 50 years ago, when you still had this wand, you could not beat me. Now the wand is in my hand, and you have spent more than 50 years shut in that tower, while I, during that time, took down another Dark Lord every bit as dangerous as you. Or are you going to summon reinforcements? Are you really unaware of your own condition, Albus? Grindelwald sneered. Seeing Dumbledore struggle to keep his stance, he curled his lips. That phoenix of yours, the one that dies for you once, can't be used right now. Your last spell drained more than half your power, and you've been poisoned by Karkaroff, a poison I personally brewed. You should know its effects better than anyone. I gave you the old wand, but I took away your phoenix and part of your strength. Fair deal. We stand on equal footing now, Albus. Very well. Dumbledore straightened completely, the fatigue and weakness vanishing as if they had never been. He no longer looked like the kindly old man. Instead, he was the imposing, indomitable great wizard who had brought down 2 generations of Dark Lords, whose reputations spread across Europe and beyond, an awe-inspiring presence with an irresistible aura quietly radiating from him. Then let me see what you've become in 50 years, Gellert. I've been waiting for you to say that, Grindelwald shouted. 2 oceans of flame, one red and one blue, split the space between them, barreling toward one another and colliding in the middle. With a thunderous roar, a towering wall of fire, dozens of meters high, rose up, cutting the battlefield in 2 and blocking sight. From the red flames marched an army in armor, unfazed by the heat, bearing swords, knives, and crossbows, advancing toward the blue, Dumbledore's finest transfiguration creations. Grindelwald answered with the blue fire. As he waved his old wand, monstrous beings of flame crawled out of those blue waves and met Dumbledore's transfigured soldiers. Curses and dark spells flew between the 2 men. For a time, destructive magic filled every inch of the arena, a grind of spells that mercilessly chewed through transfigured troops on both sides. Invisible wards, covert hexes, and counter-curses warred silently in the air and along the ground, turning the previously reinforced earth into a second battlefield. Sustained by nothing but the power of 2 old men, the devastation in that space rivaled a full-scale wizarding war. Karkaroff and Barty Crouch Jr. had prudently pulled back, braced at a safer distance and hastily weaving protective charms around themselves. Even so, their shields trembled under the aftershocks of Grindelwald's magic, forcing them to reinforce their defenses. Grindelwald's strength, so raw and fierce, made both men take a sharp breath inward. This power may rival the Master's from back then, Barty thought, and that's after losing the old wand and spending 50 years shut away. How terrible he must have been at his peak. He eyed Dumbledore with concern. Albus is struggling. Grindelwald will have no trouble putting him down. I'd hoped to pick up a powerful old wand from their battle to present to the Master, but honesty may be the safer path now. How have you softened so much, Albus? Grindelwald's voice ripped across the intermingled fires. Was a decade of ease enough to weaken your bones? Has tending to children made you forget how to fight? There was no answer from behind the wall of flame, but the red fire trembled and churned, Dumbledore's last threat of defiance. Even so, under the relentless pressure of Grindelwald's blue blaze, the red that had been holding steady was steadily being squeezed down to a sliver, then a smaller sliver, shrinking by the moment. Whatever exhaustion and poisoning Dumbledore had suffered earlier was exacting a terrible price. The man who had once bested Grindelwald with that same wand 50 years ago was now being driven back. 3,000 feet away, by the lake at Durmstrang, the mist screen continued to broadcast everything happening inside the submerged arena to the shore, regardless of the shock the images might cause. The screen showed a battlefield filled edge to edge with red and blue flames, and with countless soldiers and monsters locked in combat. Invisible spells danced in midair, dissecting transfiguration creations and then streaking toward the leaders, only to be met and neutralized by other elaborate defenses. On the ground, strange magics erupted from time to time, only to be consumed by the flames. If not for the creeping advance of the blue fire, many students and even several professors would have hesitated to say which side held the advantage. But now it was clear. Dumbledore is about to lose. Baron's left hand closed into a fist as he watched. He had steadied since the fighting began. Dumbledore's defeat at this moment was part of the plan he had been told. All he had to do now was move on to the next piece. "The headmaster's about to collapse," he blurted, startling the student nearest him. Then he drew a strange key and drove it into the ground. "We can't just stay here. Once they finish, they'll come for us. I have an alchemical escape device. Follow me." He twisted the key hard. A delicate portal opened in the earth, revealing the first-floor hall of Norberic University, the very place Avada had once visited, on the other side. 370, the most exciting day at Norwich University. Where is this place? Old Shafiq had ordered them to keep this secret. Enemy spies were embedded in Durmstrang, so no one could know what they were doing until the plan actually began. Baron hadn't told his classmates about today's events, not even Avada, whom he trusted most. Both his father and Dumbledore, who had been communicating with him in secret, had sworn the champion's safety would be guaranteed, and Baron trusted them. So when he suddenly produced a key from his sleeve and opened a doorway in midair, the Hogwarts students around him were stunned, some even suspicious. Too many strange things had happened that day. "A safe house," Baron said without preamble, stepping through first. "Professor Dumbledore secretly entrusted this place to me. He foresaw what would happen today and knew he'd lose the duel. He has a backup plan that can keep him and Ken safe. But we can't stay here." "So we're just abandoning everything and leaving?" someone asked incredulously. "This is also the principal's wish?" Baron stood in the doorway, holding the key to keep it open. "Soon many dark wizards will pour into Durmstrang to deal with the remaining students. If we stay, we won't be able to help, and we'll become a burden that only slows the principal down. Trust me, protecting ourselves now is the best way to help him." Silence fell. But because they'd lived together in a foreign land, the Hogwarts students trusted one another. A second student slipped past Baron and into the university, then a third, a fourth, until, quietly, all the Hogwarts students, except Avada, had disappeared into the strange new space. Baron let out a long breath. The heavy weight that had been pressing on him for months finally eased. He still didn't fully understand what this place called Norberic University was, but his father and Dumbledore had both assured him it was safe, and the events that had just occurred bolstered that trust. Click. Baron turned the key and the entrance closed, cutting them off from the chaos outside. Before them was a vast, empty hall. There were no windows or sunlight, yet neither the floor, nearly the size of a stadium, nor the 15-meter-high ceiling felt oppressive. The decor was classical and luxurious. Sofas and bookshelves, fountains and pianos. It was more extravagant than any Hogwarts common room. What a huge place. These were champion candidates. Their eyes were used to seeing the extraordinary. Almost immediately, they recognized something exceptional about the space. As tension ebbed, murmurs of amazement rose. "Is this all the undetectable extension charm?" "It has to be. Merlin, you could carry something this big around? Did the principal make this?" Everyone quickly assumed Dumbledore was responsible. Seeing the place and remembering Baron's remark that today's events had been expected by the principal, they began to relax. Hogwarts students had long trusted Dumbledore implicitly. This only deepened that faith. If Dumbledore had foreseen defeat, perhaps it had been part of his plan. Baron himself couldn't deny it. He knew almost nothing about Norberic University or whether Dumbledore had a hand in creating it. What if he had? "Okay, we're safe here, but what about Beauxbatons and Durmstrang?" someone asked after a moment. "Baron said a lot of dark wizards will come to deal with the remaining students," another replied. "Aren't they in danger too?" "Don't forget, the Durmstrang principal led the betrayal. Who's trustworthy there?" someone snapped. "Maybe many of them are already with those dark wizards. But enough worrying about them." Baron, who had been quiet since closing the door, interrupted. "I was only responsible for getting the Hogwarts students here. Beauxbatons and Durmstrang have people they trust to guide them. If the timing's right, they should arrive soon." No sooner had he finished than another doorway materialized on a nearby wall and swung open, revealing a scene they'd just left. Voices barked orders. "Line up! Keep order! Hurry! Don't dawdle! The door's small. We don't have much time. Move! Make space for the students behind you." A stream of young faces in red cloaks flowed through and joined them. The Hogwarts students recognized them at once, Durmstrang. Before questions could be exchanged, a third doorway opened on the opposite side. A procession of students in pale blue robes entered in turn, Beauxbatons. It became clear that people from Norberic University, hidden among the students or staff, were using keys to open doors and bring each group in. Baron guessed they were being led in batches because of the recent betrayals. Karkaroff and Ludo Bagman's treachery had sown distrust among the schools. If everyone had been brought in by a single stranger, suspicion and hesitation might have wasted time. Guided by their own people, the three groups could move efficiently despite everything that had happened. Excellent. It seems everyone is here. After the Beauxbatons and Durmstrang students had filed into the university hall and the other doors were finally shut, a sudden, loud crack of apparitions startled the still-dazed crowd. Three wizards in black robes appeared with the sound. The one who stepped forward and spoke was an elderly witch with white hair. She smiled kindly as she waved at them, clearly pleased to see so many young faces. Welcome, everyone, to Norberrick University. Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut cleanly through the murmurs and chatter and reached every ear. This meeting may be a bit sudden. I know what happened outside, and you may still have many questions. Please rest assured, I will explain what occurred today as clearly as I can and try to ease your concerns. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Miranda Goshawk, and I am the principal of this school. I expect many of you have heard that name. Miranda Goshawk. Before she could go on, the hall erupted. Students who had been close enough to see her face registered surprise and bewilderment. Anyone who had attended a wizarding school anywhere in the world would recognize Miranda Goshawk's name. Her book of spells and the later revised standard book of spells were staple texts translated into dozens of languages and used internationally. To see the great author herself standing before them, and as the head of a school they had never even heard of, Norberrick University, caused a ripple of astonishment. Norberrick? The name sounded like Norby Ridge, a former British minister for magic, but a whole university named after him, and called a university at that, was unprecedented in the wizarding world. Goshawk smiled at the reaction and continued. As for what happened just now at the Tri-Wizard tournament, be assured Professor Dumbledore and your three champions are safe. And no, Professor Karkaroff did not truly betray Dumbledore. When about Ludo Bagman? Someone called out. Hearing that Karkaroff had not turned, the tension in the hall eased a touch, but doubt remained about Bagman. That wasn't Ludo Bagman, one of the male wizards beside Goshawk answered. Our investigation indicates the real Bagman was detained and an imposter used Polyjuice Potion to pose as him and gain access to Durmstrang. Who that imposter is and how he arranged all this, we're still determining that. He exchanged a brief look with the other wizard next to him. In truth, the university's own inquiries had pointed to Barty Crouch Jr., the Death Eater thought long dead in Azkaban, but they had chosen not to make that public. They had already used the information to secure the cooperation of a senior official in the Department of Magical Games and Sports, and they planned to handle the aftermath discreetly so Aurors would find no obvious threads to follow. Since last summer, Goshawk went on, a certain faction has been trying to infiltrate and interfere with this year's tournament. Their aim is to kill Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, and to retrieve the soul of their former master, Lord Voldemort, from him. But fortunately, Dumbledore realized what was happening. He agreed to work with us to root out the plot while protecting the students. That is why you were brought here for refuge. Soon, Dumbledore will stage a defeat and then lead everyone involved in the plan to Durmstrang. The Durmstrang students exchanged confused looks. The Hogwarts students understood immediately. Kill Dumbledore and recover Voldemort's soul, the Death Eaters. Since 3 years ago, they had been a relentless source of chaos. Voldemort himself had infiltrated Hogwarts and been sealed away. The Chamber of Secrets had terrified the school that year. There had been whispered ties to the werewolf attacks that rocked Britain, and rumors had swirled about other dark schemes. The idea that they were still at work and growing bolder made many faces tighten. Madam Goshawk, what about Grindelwald, who's supposedly fighting Headmaster Dumbledore? Someone from Durmstrang asked. At that name, the hall went still. Durmstrang students in particular knew well the history of the once-feared dark wizard Grindelwald. News that he had escaped from the tower where he'd been imprisoned for 50 years could mean a new upheaval in the wizarding world. Surprisingly, Goshawk and her colleagues did not look alarmed. They exchanged a small laugh. That, Goshawk said, is the most dramatic part of the plan arranged by Dumbledore, Karkaroff, and ourselves. I'm sorry I can't reveal the full truth just yet, but you'll be able to see it for yourselves. She waved her wand, and a familiar, shimmering mist formed in the air, splitting into two screens. One showed red and blue flames tangled beneath water, clearly broadcasting an underwater duel. The other displayed the familiar lakeside at Hogwarts. What drew immediate attention, though, were the figures gathered there. A large number of people in red robes were standing at the edge of the screen, all looking up. "What's going on?" the Durmstrang students demanded. "Didn't we all evacuate inside? Why are so many people still out there?" "Don't worry, those aren't Durmstrang students," Goshawk said, smiling. "They're students from Norberic. They've been impersonating you to mislead anyone approaching and to assist with the arrests." She glanced around the hall. "There's no need to worry about their safety. I suspect they're having more fun than anyone right now. This is a placeholder. An attempt to fetch the chapter from httrlab.com/en, novel/through54, Hogwarts My Name is the Unforgivable Curse, chapter 372, failed with the following error. Error. Fetch of URL, davtrb.com/ehive354, Hogwarts My Name is the Unforgivable Curse, chapter 372 equals AI, failed. The server returned an empty chapter. If you can view the chapter on the website, try opening the URL in your browser and trying again. It's also possible you attempted to fetch an AI-translated novel that hasn't been AI-translated. 373. Dumbledore defeated. Just as Miranda Goshawk had said, the Norberic University students, dressed in red robes indistinguishable from Durmstrangs, were ecstatic. The whole operation had been rehearsed for months. For safety, every student involved was a senior elite, combat-capable, the sort who could face a professional striker, and where possible, they'd recruited Durmstrang alumni with a flair for acting. So although the Death Eaters hadn't yet been assembled, the students were happily retracing old paths, proudly showing their alma mater to classmates who had never attended Durmstrang. "It's been ages since I was here," someone cried. Most of them barely glanced at the fierce duel between Dumbledore and Grindelwald playing on the enchanted screen. They gaped at the lake and the castle instead. "Nothing's changed since I graduated. I wonder if this batch even remembers the legends I left behind." "Don't act like it was ages ago. You only graduated 2 years ago," a nearby Durmstrang professor snapped, scowling. "And I still remember that bag of dung bombs you let off in the corridor. If only you hadn't run off so quickly back then." Cough, cough. "Professor, don't get too worked up. We still have to get to the castle and set the scene." Ouch, that hurt. The Durmstrang professors looked neither shocked nor angry at the sudden influx of former students. They laughed, exchanged memories, and good-naturedly scolded the old troublemakers. The Norberic Picts had naturally been the cream of the crop from Durmstrang. Whether model students or notorious pranksters, each had left a deep impression on the faculty. Even Madame Maxime and Barty Crouch Sr., who had appeared anxious at first, relaxed visibly when they saw the university students arrive and fell into easy conversation with visiting professors like Belby and Tellenboo. In fact, apart from Barty Crouch Jr., the entire judging panel and almost all the Durmstrang faculty were actors. He had thought he'd successfully impersonated Ludo Bagman and fooled everyone. In truth, he'd been the one kept in the dark. They behaved with an ease entirely at odds with facing a resurrected Dark Lord. No tension, no sense of imminent danger, as if they were on a casual tour rather than at the center of a life-or-death struggle. Ludo Bagman, who had been kidnapped, was at least still alive. Otherwise, he couldn't have been supplying polyjuice potion ingredients for Barty. Where Bagman was being held and what shape he was in, the actors hadn't fully determined, nor did they plan to, at least for now. Partly that was to avoid alarming Barty and spoiling the long preparations, and partly because, in their view, his plight had been well earned. Under the lake at Durmstrang, the site of the original Triwizard final task, the duel was reaching its end. In just over 10 minutes, a fight that had once seemed evenly matched was collapsing. Grindelwald's blue flames rolled through the underwater chamber like a true sea, sweeping every corner. The crimson fire that had represented Dumbledore was pushed back to the edge of that ocean of blue, a lone sail in a storm, trembling on the brink. Dumbledore stood at the center of those shrinking crimson flames, pale, the arm holding his wand shaking so violently his magic barely held. "You've lost, Albus." The voice cut through the thunder of magic. The blue flames bowed in unison, receding to either side and opening a path. Through it, Gellert Grindelwald walked, wand in hand, as if sauntering onto a stage. The rush of flame tossed his hair and robes, but it only emphasized his composed elegance. He stopped in front of Dumbledore and tapped the remaining crimson barrier with the tip of his wand. Crack! Dumbledore's final defense shattered with a dull, heavy sound. He looked up at Grindelwald's wand, and to the surprise of those watching, his eyes were calm, deep and still like an ancient well. Even the tremor had left his arms and beard. "Your progress in magic is unexpectedly good," Dumbledore said. There was no hint of fatigue or fear in his voice. "But your thinking hasn't improved at all. Honestly, I'm disappointed, Gellert. Since you haven't been cut off from the outside world these 50 years, you must know how the magical community has changed without your interference. You know whether Muggles and Muggleborns have harmed wizarding society the way you imagined, and you know what kind of man Tom Riddle is. You'd do well to show more respect to the Dark Lord, Dumbledore." Barty Crouch Jr., who had been watching the battle for some time, stepped forward now. His wand threw off a dangerous light. "If you don't want to suffer more, it's not your place to speak." Grindelwald shot him a cold look. An invisible pressure tightened at Barty's chest, as if some apex predator had singled him out. "I can help resurrect your Dark Lord," Grindelwald said, "but Dumbledore must be dealt with by my own hand. Don't forget your promise, Death Eater." Barty's fingers closed around his wand until they ached, but in the end, he stepped back. He had wanted the Dark Lord to be the one to end Dumbledore, to give his master that first personal victory after resurrection. But his overzealous allies had invited this old enemy of Dumbledore instead and stolen the glory. There was no alternative. Barty Crouch Jr. was just one pawn among many plucked from midstream and used in a larger design. The tasks he'd been entrusted with were important, but they didn't put him in a position to argue with Grindelwald. He wondered briefly whether Wormtail, the one who had orchestrated so much of the operation and whose cunning intimidated even his fellow conspirators, if Wormtail had been present, might he have negotiated with Grindelwald? Probably not. Even though Wormtail had been the biggest contributor to the plan, Grindelwald hadn't been invited by him. "Don't forget, the creed I uphold was something you and I forged together, and you are the one who betrayed it, Albus." After dismissing Barty, Grindelwald's gaze returned to Dumbledore, who stood silent. "Perhaps you're right," Dumbledore said. "In the past 50-odd years, there has been little upheaval between wizards and Muggles. Muggles still live and develop freely under the sun, and wizards still cling to survival in the shadows, but that fragile balance will be broken sooner or later. You saw that then. So I can admit I was arrogant and blind back then. You cannot." As if resigned, Dumbledore tossed the old wand in his hand toward Grindelwald. Grindelwald caught it without a flicker of hesitation. Dumbledore closed his eyes. "All right. It's back with its rightful owner. You don't need to explain further. Our beliefs cannot be swayed by words. Kill me and go down your path of no return. Wrong is wrong, and it won't become right simply because the executor is powerful," Grindelwald replied. "You beat me, that's true. But another me, or someone wiser and stronger, will one day rise to correct what you've started. My soul will wait for you in another world, Gellert." "Heh, don't rile me," Grindelwald sneered. "I'm not planning to kill you yet." Lord Grindelwald, Karkaroff, who stood nearby, appeared about to speak, but Barty stepped forward, panic in his voice. "This isn't what we agreed." "What's different?" Grindelwald asked, smiling faintly at first. His smile hardened. "I never promised to take his life from the start. I only promised to deal with him, make him no longer a problem for you Death Eaters. And even if I had promised to kill him, what right do you have to bargain with me if I decided to go back on my word now?" He fixed Barty with a cold stare. "Dumbledore and your master, Lord Voldemort, are in my hands. Not a single force in Europe can stop me now." Barty's face went pale as Grindelwald's voice took on an icier edge. You'd do well to show me respect, Death Eater. Your master can be resurrected only because I'm in a good mood and willing to honor my word. Don't give me reason to lose interest in doing so. I'm sorry, Lord Grindelwald. Barty swallowed and bowed quickly before retreating beneath Karkaroff's watchful eyes. Grindelwald turned back to Dumbledore, raising the reclaimed old wand toward him. But I won't be as foolish as you, letting an opponent I've finally defeated remain free to scheme and escape. My Nermangard has been altered especially for you, Albus. You can enjoy your twilight there and occasionally hear good news from my side. One last question. Where did you hide Lord Voldemort's soul? Do you think I'd tell you that? Dumbledore's face showed no fear. Calmly, he countered, Of course not. But unfortunately for you, this old wand you returned is rather too powerful. It makes my legilimency able to cut through your occlumency. Stupefy. A brilliant red bolt of light, bright enough to illuminate the entire underwater chamber, flashed from the old wand and struck Dumbledore squarely in the chest. The residual shock of the spell washed over Barty and Karkaroff, leaving them momentarily weak. Dumbledore, struck directly, crumpled without resistance and hit the floor with a dull thud. Your master's soul has always been with him, inside this black diary, Grindelwald said as he manipulated Dumbledore's limp body. Under magic's influence, things began to fly from the old man's robes, appearances from hidden pockets, layers of clothing turned inside out, until an exquisite glass vial filled with gray smoke and a jet-black notebook hovered into Grindelwald's hand. Grindelwald examined them with visible interest. Horcruxes. Fascinating. I didn't even conceive of this method of preserving a soul for immortality. I'm at the point where I need to pursue longevity myself, he continued. I hope Lord Voldemort will be sufficiently grateful to share his secret of immortality with the one who saved his life. At that, Barty's mind snapped into focus. Of course, that was why Grindelwald had been so willing to keep his promise and resurrect Voldemort. He wanted the secret of immortality. Grindelwald tucked the vial and the black notebook away and glanced at Karkaroff. Are all the materials for the resurrection ready, Igor? They are, Lord Grindelwald, Karkaroff replied with a respectful bow. I have them on me. Very good. Grindelwald nodded. Then it's time to return to the surface and gather your companions to witness your master's return. You and those involved in the plan all bear the dark mark, yes? 375. Dark mark. Of course, my Lord Grindelwald, Karkaroff replied, bowing slightly. He extended his arms toward Grindelwald and Barty. Take hold of me, and I'll lift you out. I should remind you, at your request, I had the events broadcast through the Triwizard transmission. Everyone at Durmstrang saw what happened. We may meet resistance when we return. What a joke, Grindelwald sneered, clutching Dumbledore's collar. The headmaster still slumped at his side. After they've seen Dumbledore defeated by me, what sort of resistance do you think they'll manage? Isn't that why I insisted on the broadcast, to utterly crush their morale? Even if they try to rely on Durmstrang's defenses and stubbornly hold out, we still have you, Principal Karkaroff, Barty added. By the way, can you lift the apparition ban here? It wasn't easy to humiliate Dumbledore publicly. I don't want any more complications. Of course, my lord, Karkaroff said confidently, drawing his wand and waving it. This was planned from the start. Let's go up. Grindelwald took a breath, and one arm slung over Karkaroff, the other gripping Dumbledore. He and Barty each seized an arm of the headmaster and Karkaroff. With a sudden twist of his body, the four of them spun, and the dim, underwater world vanished. Above the lake, the Durmstrang grounds lay in bright midday light. Golden sun warmed the placid water and the deserted yellow-green lawn, lending an unexpected softness to the still chilly May air. A student could have lain on the grass for an after-lunch nap and been perfectly content. But the vast protective shield over the ancient castle glowed with a dangerous, fierce light, proof that nothing there was as safe as it appeared. The spectator stands were a mess and strangely empty, as if everyone who had been there had fled in terror and never returned. Bang! An apparition tore through the silence. 4 figures materialized not far from the stands. Grindelwald, Karkaroff, Barty Crouch Jr., still wearing Ludo Bagman's face, and Albus Dumbledore, unconscious and dangled by his collar. They've cowered behind the castle, have they? Grindelwald said, looking up at the shield that sealed Durmstrang. He snorted softly. If the professors had chosen to fight here instead of hiding, there might have been some chance of stopping him, but courage was missing where he'd expected it most. Let them watch. After seeing Dumbledore fall, they'll witness the rebirth of a Dark Lord and the rise of a new order. Karkaroff, have the apparition bans been lifted? Karkaroff waved his wand. All restrictions outside the castle are lifted. I no longer have authority to break the wards inside. The shield will hold everything within tightly. That will do. This place will be ours soon enough. A few minutes mean nothing, Grindelwald said, indifferent. Prepare the resurrection ritual. He withdrew the old wand he'd taken from Dumbledore and turned to Barty. Can you summon your companions now? Barty's voice trembled. He had waited for this moment for so long. Having been locked away in a dark cell not long ago, the past months had felt dreamlike. He had once thought his fellow Death Eaters had betrayed their master. Instead, they were as loyal as ever and more capable. A powerful dark wizard, Gellert Grindelwald, second only to their master, had joined them and had even bested Dumbledore. Now, the master was about to be reborn in sight of them all. Tears pricked Barty's eyes. Yes, he managed. Then show me your dark mark. Grindelwald's voice was flat. He did not indulge Barty's emotion. Barty rolled up his sleeve and revealed a bare left forearm. Under the polyjuice potion, he wore Bagman's appearance. His real dark mark was hidden. But the old wand in Grindelwald's hand cared little for such disguises. Originally, the dark mark's summoning magic had been controlled by Voldemort alone. A Death Eater's mark could notify only their master. But Grindelwald, a formidable dark wizard in his own right, had studied the mark and deciphered its workings. He could mimic the signal and summon the others on Voldemort's behalf. Some Death Eaters had grumbled that it usurped their master's authority. Pragmatism won out. The ones in Britain needed a way to confirm a true victory at Durmstrang, and a wizard of Grindelwald's stature, who had aided greatly in the resurrection, could claim the right to act. Then, Grindelwald swept the old wand over Barty's arm. The hidden dark mark flared into view, a black skull with a snake coiling through it. A faint, satisfied smile crossed the older man's face. Allow me to present the first gift to my successor. The wand tip poked Barty's dark mark. A burning shock stabbed his mind, sharp and immediate. Pain meant the summons had been sent, but Barty no longer cared about the sting. He fixed his tear-filled gaze on the ritual that Karkaroff was arranging, unblinking. Every emotion concentrated on the rebirth that was about to begin. 376. Death Eaters, assemble. When Grindelwald's old wand brushed Barty Crouch's dark mark, the sound seemed to suck the air out of Durmstrang. Karkaroff continued mixing potions at the resurrection altar, preparing the last stages of the ritual, while neither Barty nor Grindelwald spoke. They simply watched him work, as if waiting on a cue. 5 or 6 minutes passed. Karkaroff finished everything required for the resurrection. Only Lord Voldemort's soul remained absent. The castle, wrapped in a massive protective shield, was unnaturally quiet. Those inside seemed to have lost all will to resist, cowering behind the wards and helplessly watching their master's return. Crack! A sharp crack of apparition split the silence. A figure in a black robe appeared near Grindelwald. "You are?" someone asked. Grindelwald only glanced at the newcomer and turned his attention back to Karkaroff. Barty, however, scrutinized the man, eyes narrowing. "You're Avery?" "It is I." Avery still had sweat on his brow. He panted as he bowed deeply to Grindelwald, receiving no response. After catching his breath, he turned to Barty, voice trembling a little as he blurted, "Ludo Bagman, no, you're Crouch, right?" "Sorry, Britain's a bit farther away than I expected," the man said, recovering himself. "I guess this must be the northernmost part of Europe, but I'm the fastest. The others should be here soon." Crack! Before he finished, another crack rang out, and another black-robed figure appeared. The apparitions began to pop relentlessly across the Durmstrang lawn, and more figures coalesced out of thin air. Not McNair, Crabbe, Goyle, Malfoy, Rabiston, Caro, Yaxley. Barty watched them arrive and whispered their names under his breath. Those who had just appeared, like him, bore the dark mark and had felt the summons first, rushing here at once. He knew, though, that most were opportunists, people who had avoided Azkaban by drawing neat lines of separation when their master fell, or by betraying comrades, then lounging about while their master suffered. Even the ones who'd supposedly helped had mostly contributed little more than a few galleons. Only a few had truly labored for the master's return. Of that group, only Wormtail bore the dark mark. Others like Shafake and Rosier were not even former Death Eaters from a decade ago. Barty's thoughts turned sour. Dumbledore's public betrayals of pureblood interests had driven many of those forces back to Voldemort, accelerating his resurrection. Those Death Eaters who weren't locked in Azkaban should be ashamed. He glanced covertly at Karkaroff by the altar and cursed inwardly. Whether his bitterness sprang from Karkaroff's past betrayals or from jealousy that Karkaroff, not he, would be conducting the resurrection ritual, he couldn't tell. Either way, he thought, Karkaroff shouldn't imagine his treacheries would go unpunished when the master awoke and saw so many servants behind bars. The stream of apparitions eventually dwindled and halted. The grounds were now crowded with dozens of black-robed wizards, some former Death Eaters, others purebloods who had thrown in with the resurrection plan. There were even many who hadn't been involved at all, but had panicked and come running after feeling the dark mark stir, now milling about and asking anxious questions. "Is everyone here?" Barty began to count aloud. "Bellatrix, Rodolphus, and Dolohov aren't. They're in Azkaban. Severus Snape isn't here either. He didn't take part in the planning, so he must have betrayed us." "Wait, where are Wormtail and Shafake?" He froze. "Where are the two who made the biggest contributions?" For 12 years, Wormtail had gathered indispensable intelligence from deep undercover work, the details of his own supposed imprisonment among them. He'd organized the Triwizard Tournament deception, orchestrated the Polyjuice substitutions of Moody and Bagman, and arranged the plan's final safeguards. It was no exaggeration to say Wormtail accounted for at least half the operation's success. And Johnson Shafake, formerly head of his family and not a Death Eater before, he'd been the one to open the line to Gellert Grindelwald and persuade him to help. Just gaining Grindelwald's aid might have outshone every other contribution except Wormtail's. Grindelwald's involvement had brought an unforeseen advantage, a contingency the master might not even notice. That contingency had been entrusted to Wormtail, the finest infiltrator, to carry out personally. Grindelwald, who had been quietly observing the arrivals, furrowed his brow with a brief flicker of doubt. Johnson Shafake's absence at this moment was by design, planned from the outset, but Peter Pettigrew's failure to appear was not part of the plan. He shook his head and let it go. Whatever delay Pettigrew had run into, it would be overcome. With the unbreakable vow and Minerva's supervision, the most important part would not be allowed to fail. Prepare, then, to welcome the final act. "Trap! Trap!" Several voices rose in alarm. "Excellent." Gellert Grindelwald looked up, scanned the assembly, some faces barely containing exultation, others edged with fear, and inclined his head. "Since everyone who should be here has arrived, let us begin, and remind your master later that he owes me a favor. Igor, start." "Yes." Karkaroff bowed respectfully to Grindelwald, drew his old wand, and aimed it at the resurrection altar. There stood a huge, ornate cauldron filled with a deep purple potion. Sunlight struck its surface and threw back an uncanny sheen. The cauldron's walls were inlaid with runic characters and precious metals that pulsed faintly with magic, reacting to the potion and setting the liquid to a slow, sinister motion. At the very bottom lay an unlit brazier, pointed at by Karkaroff's wand. As he intoned a long, complicated charm in a low voice, pale blue flames flared into life in the brazier. The instant the first wisp of flame licked the cauldron's base, the potion flared from purple to a fiery red and began to boil. Steam billowed up, thick and blinding, until the faces of Grindelwald and Karkaroff were almost lost to the Death Eaters. "It's ready, Lord Grindelwald," Karkaroff called, and the words sent ripples of hope through the gathered followers. Grindelwald stepped forward, produced a small bottle from within his cloak, tapped its mouth with his wand, and began to pour. There was hardly any breath in the place. Everyone knew what that little bottle contained. 3 years ago, Dumbledore had revealed it to the world, the fractured soul of Lord Voldemort, captured and sealed. Voldemort had been a wandering spirit for 11 years, and then imprisoned in that small phial for 3. Now, with Dumbledore supposedly defeated and Grindelwald triumphant, their master stood on the brink of being restored, ready to lead them all back to pure blood glory. Sparse gray vapors slithered from the bottle and fell into the boiling cauldron. Even through the steam, they watched as the first tendrils of mist touched the surface, and a fierce burst of light flared up. The potion began to evaporate at an alarming rate. A towering column of steam shot skyward, dispersed, and then sank back down, washing the camp in a reddish fog. "This isn't right. Resurrections don't do this," murmured a Death Eater, coughing in the vapor. They had expected the potion to reshape a body, not to vanish into the air. If the steam had been harmful, poisonous, hypnotic, paralyzing, they would have suspected Grindelwald and Karkaroff of plotting to wipe everyone out. But the vapors seemed innocuous. For now at least no one felt poisoned or drugged. Wait, this steam. A few among them covertly produced wands to test the vapor, their expressions blanching as they took readings. "No! Run! This gas is—" Before the cry could be finished, Grindelwald struck the cauldron hard with his wand. The runes carved into the metal flared with a blinding light. Wherever those beams fell through the fog, the composition of the steam changed into something entirely new and terrible. The Death Eaters could not name it, but every instinct screamed danger. "Grindelwald, Karkaroff, what are you doing?" one man began, but his voice died halfway. Words failed him. The steam that had seemed harmless moments before had been altered by the runic light and somehow silenced their tongues. A cold, private roar of panic rose in every chest. They reached for their wands and tried to shout commands, reliant now on wandless magic, but soundless mouths and clotted throats made speech impossible. Some tried nonverbal casting, but their strength burnt away. Even wandless efforts were crippled and feeble. They tried to apparate, but discovered too late that the apparition ban Karkaroff had earlier lifted had been reasserted. A solid, invisible barrier had materialized around them. Trapped, voiceless, and half-stripped of magic, they thudded helplessly against it. Then a voice cut through, old and delighted. Grindelwald and Karkaroff had retreated beyond the barrier. The great shield that had cloaked Durmstrang moments before had vanished. Grindelwald laughed and called out to the castle and the caged crowd. "The true third task of the Triwizard Tournament officially begins now." At the same instant, something monstrous invaded the minds of those trapped within the barrier and shredded the fragile threads of their composure. Grindelwald's aged face began to melt like wax. Skin slid and reformed, hair and beard unspooling and then knitting themselves into a different shape. Long white whiskers sprouted from his chin. Where Grindelwald had stood, Albus Dumbledore slowly took shape. Beside him, the man who had supposedly been left unconscious, who had been propped up as a decoy, sprang to his feet with a nimble grin, waving toward the castle and the prisoners. Then his features, too, began to shift under the same strange transfiguration. The Dumbledore, who had been feigning defeat, warped and refashioned himself until finally the true face underneath revealed itself. Alastor Moody, 378, real third project. If the steam hadn't already left them speechless, those usually refined pure-blood nobles would have cursed out loud. After all that trouble, the two most important figures on their side turned out to be moles planted by the other side. Even the Grindelwald they had personally visited at Nurmengard was an imposter. Seeing Barty Crouch Jr. among the trapped, equally mute and bewildered, only added to their fury. Now first, I will announce the true rules for the third task of the Triwizard Tournament. Albus Dumbledore chuckled as figures streamed out of Durmstrang Castle now that its protective barrier had been lifted. Madame Maxime, Igor Karkaroff, and an oddly pale-looking Barty Crouch Sr. had already returned to the judge's table. Beside them, Alastor Moody grinned so broadly he could hardly suppress it. Clearing his throat, Dumbledore announced loudly, "All those Death Eaters summoned by Lord Voldemort's resurrection, together with the criminals who attempted to enter Nurmengard illegally to help a high-security prisoner escape, have been confined within the barrier and deprived of the ability to speak or cast spells. What our three champions must do is defeat as many of these still formidable prisoners as possible. Their score for this round will be the number of people they defeat, and the final champion of the Triwizard Tournament will be decided by the total scores across all three tasks. Beyond forbidding the champions from attacking or interfering with one another, there are no restrictions on the actions or spells they may use. Although the prisoners can no longer cast magic and their power is greatly reduced, they remain vicious individuals, and fighting them still carries great danger. Rest assured, Professor Karkaroff, I and Mr. Alastair Moody will act as safety officers to monitor the battle and ensure the champions are not exposed to truly life-threatening peril. Attribution of targets in this free-for-all will be decided by the 4 judges through playback after the competition ends. All right, those are the rules. Next, please welcome our 3 champions to the arena to prepare for the competition. It's our turn. Inside Durmstrang Castle, in the principal's office, Avada, who had been sitting comfortably in a high-backed chair watching the broadcast, sat up. He forced down the lingering surprise, set his teacup down, climbed out of the chair, and turned to look at Crumb and Fleur, who still looked nervous. Earlier, when the Phantom ship's water teleportation had been disrupted by Barty's secret passage, the 3 champions had escaped the illusory ship using pre-prepared Phoenix feather portkeys and landed directly in the principal's office. From there, they watched the clash between the Grindelwald and Dumbledore on the mist screen and had been shocked by the final twist. Even Avada, who knew more than the others, had only known that Dumbledore had been impersonated by Moody since the Christmas ball. He had never expected Grindelwald to be a fake as well. That suggested the real Grindelwald most likely never left Nurmengard, so why had he always refused visitors? Not just before Christmas, but for the last 5 months, he had repeatedly barred university professors from visiting. Aside from this unexpected detail, the rest of the plan had gone exactly as scripted. The wizards who had plotted to kill Dumbledore, or who still served Voldemort, had all been gathered. Now they were lambs to the slaughter, waiting for the champions to come down and deal with them. At Norberic University, his Crew Impuri clone had settled the students and professors who had come seeking refuge. Avada had returned to his rooms and lain down, temporarily freed from active control, as his mental energy flowed back into his main body to prepare for the upcoming battle. He had suspected Baron was the one who opened the university's door at Hogwarts, but he'd received no news from Baron. If Baron understood the importance of this plan, his secrecy was absolute. Even Avada, who could perceive mental energy directly, hadn't been able to find where Baron had hidden himself until he heard that someone among the Hogwarts students possessed the Norberic University key. Normally, he had never seen the key's unique magical structure on Baron, so perhaps the key had only recently been delivered. Forget it, he decided. He wouldn't worry about that now. He had to put on a good show for the university's reputation. Let's go. Crumb and Fleur rose more slowly, glancing one last time at the enormous barrier visible through the window, and followed Avada toward the door. Tension showed clearly on their faces. They were about to face real dark wizards, killers. Though the prisoners could no longer cast spells, and therefore could not use unforgivable curses or other advanced dark arts, those trapped inside were veterans of wizarding wars or core members of pureblood families with deep lineages. There was even a powerful dark wizard like Barty Crouch Jr., who had once impersonated Moody. Their combat ability could not be underestimated, and their numbers, dozens of them, were sufficient to apply tremendous pressure. No matter how outstanding these students were, they were still only a few schoolchildren, not yet graduated. One of them was only a 5th year. When they first heard the true nature of this task from Ken, they had wondered if the judges had gone mad, and had admired Ken for being able to announce it without a single change of expression. As for Avada, his only worry now was whether his performance would be spectacular enough. After all, he knew this task had been tailored for him. 379. Final Battle. On the broad lawn outside Durmstrang Castle, the scattered spectator stands had already been reassembled with the help of the efficient students from Norberic University. Not far away, several large doors had appeared on the open ground as if by magic. The students from the 3 schools who had sheltered inside the university now filed out in a daze. They had watched everything that had just happened at Durmstrang via the university's mist screens. What? Lord Voldemort was to be resurrected? What? Grindelwald was a fake? What? Dumbledore was a fake too? What? They wanted 3 champions who hadn't even graduated to face dozens of notorious dark wizards? Were they insane? Overwhelmed by one horrifying thought after another, the students were nearly stunned into silence, accepting the increasingly bizarre reality with only a numb, sick disbelief. Even Baron and the other keepers of the university keys were no exception. They had only been asked to open the doors and shepherd students inside. They had not been told the full plan. As for what would happen next, none of them knew. And this performance, staged by Dumbledore and Grindelwald, no, by Moody and Dumbledore, had far outstripped anything they had imagined. Who could have guessed that a seemingly ordinary Triwizard tournament concealed so many traps? A few minutes later, the grounds outside Durmstrang had been transformed completely. The stands that had once surrounded the large lake now ringed a massive magical barrier holding dozens of dark wizards. The seating had been expanded many times over, easily accommodating the students from the three schools, plus the new arrivals from Norberich. Nearby, the judges' platform still sat on its high stage, but the number of seats had shrunk from 5 to 4. Ludo Bagman, originally a judge, now languished inside the barrier as one of the imprisoned dark wizards. The students had taken their places under the direction of their professors and heads, but the previous buzz of commentary and excitement was gone. Almost everyone sat with furrowed brows, shifting uneasily. Simply being there made them nervous, especially the Hogwarts students. After all, among the dozens of imprisoned dark wizards were many faces they recognized. Former board member Lucius Malfoy, Ministry Executioner McNair, descendants of the Caro family, and Knots, and the former Quidditch professional and head of the Department of Magical Games and Sports, Ludo Bagman. Were they really colluding with Grindelwald, plotting to kill Dumbledore and resurrect Lord Voldemort? A dull sound broke through the tense murmur. The main gate of Durmstrang, which had been sealed, was slowly opening again. As the gap widened, 3 figures were gradually illuminated by the sunlight and revealed themselves behind the gate. It was Avada, looking slightly anxious, and behind him Crumb and Fleur, both visibly more nervous. "Excellent, the 3 champions have arrived," Dumbledore intoned. After Ludo Bagman had been trapped in the barrier, Dumbledore had taken over as commentator. He stood on the high platform, a small, dull-colored bird perched on his shoulder, surveying the bustle inside and outside the barrier. The smile on his face, however, looked forced. "Now, let us enjoy the final round of this Triwizard tournament together," he said. "How will the finest champion among these 3 students fare against more than 40 dark wizards who cannot cast spells and can only use wandless magic? I know this event may not be as safe as previous ones. Therefore, to further guarantee the champions' safety, in addition to Principal Karkaroff granting them permission to apparat within Durmstrang Castle, we have obtained authorization from both the British and French Ministries of Magic and from Durmstrang's staff. The champions may use any spell in this match without being held accountable afterward." "Any spell?" the students below exclaimed. The last time such sweeping clearance had been granted to use any spell had been to an Auror during the First Wizarding War, spells that had included the 3 unforgivable curses and other devastating dark arts. "Furthermore," Dumbledore continued, "they will be wearing the same anti-spell cloaks used in the second task. If they suffer a life-threatening attack, the cloaks will automatically apparate them out of the arena, but that will count as a failed challenge. Numal, champions, please enter the arena and begin." At his words, 3 smaller shields sprang up inside the larger barrier, each enclosing an empty space. Avada, Crumb, and Fleur apparated in, each taking one of these enclosures. In the current mood, no one paid any attention to why a 5th year like Avada could apparate. The dark wizards trapped within the larger shield, who had been testing the barrier with small, constant efforts, stared in surprise. The smaller shields were soundproof. Seeing the students assembled outside, the dark wizards assumed Dumbledore was making a spectacle of himself, perhaps trying to disgrace some master who could never have been resurrected. Why were champions being let in now? Were the champions themselves part of the display, objects for their amusement? "The champions' shields will be removed in 10 seconds, Dumbledore announced. Inside their individual enclosures, the champions heard him clearly. The crowd and the contestants drew deep breaths, trying to steady wildly pounding hearts fingers closing hard around wands. Avada centered his attention on the one he considered the greatest threat on the field, Barty Crouch Jr., now disguised as Bagman, an opponent with the strength to match the legendary Auror Moody. Feeling a long-lost, substantial mental power return to him, Avada gripped his wand tighter and locked his gaze on Barty, who looked around, puzzled. He thought, the wand's artifact transformation wasn't finished before the match began. I haven't reached my ideal combat power yet, but I can still use a bit of soul magic, and no one knows about that. So, how far have I come? He wondered. He would take this chance to test it. Raising his wand, and with 5 seconds left on the countdown, Avada lightly touched his forehead and sent a silent, invisible surge of magic into himself. Whatever force it was, anyone who sensed it would have been shaken. An incomparable, indescribable sensation welled up from the depths of his soul. For the first time, he felt himself not as a collection of vitality, mental power, and soul stitched together, but as a true, seamless whole. Every thought sprang from the depths of him, and every ounce of power he summoned carried the full force of his entire being. There was no discord anywhere. Each idea, each movement, came from the same core. Is this what it means to mobilize the soul? The 5-second countdown suddenly stretched out like an eternity for Avada. He had time to splay his hand and study every line on his palm, to savor the unfamiliar surge that bloomed when his fingers closed and the old wand warmed in his right hand. His mental power and vitality felt lifted by something deeper, reaching heights he'd never known. His attention, his perception, the speed of his thoughts, the coordination of his limbs, even the clarity of his magical senses, everything had changed from the instant before. It was the first time he had channeled soul magic on himself. After stripping the soul fragments from Harry, the memory of soul knowledge refined and matured over 5 months until he finally learned how to apply soul magic directly. For now it was rudimentary, but having a soul and not having a soul were clearly different levels entirely. No wonder the previous wielders of the old wand had felt something like this. Though the old wand was an instrument, this was his own soul at work. What level of power could he reach in this state? Outside the arena, Dumbledore's countdown still echoed across the crowd and among the champions, tugging at nerves everywhere. 3, 2, 1, let the battle begin. The shield separating the champions from the dozens of dark wizards vanished. The air that had felt merely tense shifted into something openly dangerous, dozens of hostile eyes trained on them, dozens of wands raised. The instant the barrier fell, Crumb and Fleur moved in the same unspoken way. Disillusionment charms. Even at Durmstrang, where the dark arts were taught more freely, the disillusionment charm was restricted. But the champions had known the format of this round for months and had spent those 5 months training without magical restrictions. With their principles backing, they'd mastered many formerly forbidden spells. Crumb had even been pushed by Karkaroff at one point to learn the unforgivable curses. Though he'd refused, he only wanted Quidditch. The stakes these champions faced were enormous. Avada's heightened senses let him read their intentions. Crumb appeared to be preparing a stealth ambush. Fleur's Vila blood was waking, and she seemed poised to blanket the area with overwhelming force. Most of the dark wizards, muzzled by their inability to speak and stunned by the sudden exposure, had not yet organized themselves. That confusion favored the champions, but only until the first assault began. Then their opponents would quickly retaliate. Before they could, Avada decided to deal with the most troublesome of them, or perhaps it wasn't necessary. His mind, now quick as lightning, parsed the battlefield in an instant. He didn't cast a concealment or a shield. He stood exposed, within range of a dozen wands, and watched every micro-movement in slow motion. Then he focused on one figure, Barty Crouch Jr., who had just pulled off a difficult silent disillusionment charm and was tucked into a corner, waiting and observing. Pop! In a single soft sound, Avada's body disappeared from where he stood and reappeared less than a meter in front of Barty. Before mastering soul magic, he might have had to slip through a spatial gap and wait for the opportune moment. Now there was no need for such subtleties. Barty, already stretched thin by years of resistance to the Imperio and the constant strain of that wariness, jumped at the sudden apparition. His hand jerked and his old wand flashed. He spat out a powerful dark arts curse, silent, precise, the kind of spell that could fell an auror. Barty had not been on the battlefield for over a decade, but his mental resilience had sharpened. He was sure he could match any of his old master's Death Eaters. It was the sight of the spell that made Barty curl his lips into the beginning of a grim smile. He expected the boy-turned-champion to be blindsided by the attack. "You can tell my position despite my disillusionment charm," he thought. "But you should have come from behind, reckless boy." What happened next baffled him. The champion in front of him, Avada, moved with a speed and purpose that seemed to bypass reflexes. He lifted his arm and the old wand as if they had wills of their own. The tip of his wand met the path of Barty's curse and stopped it, not with a shield, but by literally catching and turning the magic. The spell reversed on the spot, flaring brighter, redirecting back toward the caster with greater speed and precision. Barty hadn't even finished forming the smile when the curse slammed into his chest. There was a muffled thud. Barty's eyes bulged. Blood seemed to swell in his throat, doomed to burst from his mouth and nose. Before a single drop could appear, Avada's wand pressed to Barty's chest again, faster than the hit had landed. With an unprecedented reparo and a stupefy produced through double casting, Avada instantaneously knit the wound and struck Barty into deep unconsciousness. Barty was solved in 1 second.